I think if you were going to start us off, Amy, I think the recording's going. So
okay. Oh. Okay, is that not less echoey now? Hi everyone, my name is Amy Starcheski, and I'm very honored to start us off and introduce our speaker today. This training is part of an ongoing training series as part of the Oral History Association's funding through the American Rescue Act from the National Endowment for the Humanities, which has allowed us to provide fellowships to 11 oral historians for the year and provide training based on their needs and desires, which is open to a broad public as well. So thank you all for joining us today. We're very lucky to have Michael Wynne with us. Michael Wynne is the Digital Applications Librarian in the Center for Digital Scholarship and Curation at Washington State University. He is the primary support specialist for Mukurtu CMS and is a member of the Mukurtu development team. His core work revolves around ethical digital cultural heritage management and through other programs and partnerships at the CDSC. He provides support and training for digitization, digital preservation, and related topics. So we've got someone here to teach us about this tool who is right in the heart of developing it. And I'm just so tool that I've been curious about for a long time, that I've wished more oral historians had access to, and that I'm so grateful for this opportunity to learn about today. So with that, I'll turn it over to Michael with many thanks.
thank you so much. Let me just get my screen sharing underway, and then I will go from there. And one more button to move. All right. So yeah, thank you so much for the introduction. The only other thing I would add to that is that Washington State University, our Pullman campus, is located on the homelands of Namibu Nez Perce tribe and the Palouse people. We acknowledge their presence there since time immemorial and recognize their continuing connection to the land, the water, and their ancestors. I myself, I'm actually based in Victoria, BC, so I live and work on the territories of the Lekwungen and Wasanich peoples up here. Before I get underway, please feel free to ask any questions as they come up. I know we will have plenty of time for questions at the end, but if there's a burning question as I go, certainly feel free. I'll try to keep an eye on chat, and folks can ping me if needed.
Michael, I'll just jump in to say that we see the back end of your slides with your notes and everything.
Really? Well, that's exciting. Let me go ahead and
I always
like
that. The little behind the scenes glimpse, but I don't know if this, I figured you didn't intend that.
Yeah, let me just, I thought I had the right screen sharing. There we go. So sorry about that.
That's okay.
I changed my audio. That should look better now. You didn't miss much as far as the screen share goes there. Sorry about that. So starting at the top, Mukurtu is a free and open source content management system and community access platform built with the specific needs of Indigenous communities in mind for curating, sharing, and managing digital cultural heritage materials. As noted, our team at WSU, we develop and maintain the code and provide support, outreach, and training for Mukurtu CMS. Mukurtu is used primarily by Indigenous communities around the world, but as well as other user groups. It gives communities a tool to decide how to make content available based on their own protocols for viewing and circulation. One really important note is that Mukurtu has been developed as and is intended to work as one part of a larger digital preservation ecosystem, specifically as an access tool within that. So it's most effective when it's used in conjunction with other digital preservation system services and workflows. There's 5 core features that set Mukurtu apart from other platforms in the content management, or sort of in the broader cultural heritage management realm. We're going to go into most of these in a little more depth throughout the presentation. First off, we have flexible cultural protocols. These allow granular access to the content of Mukurtu's site, whether we're talking about cultural materials, language, photographs, oral histories, or anything else. Protocols are really the core thing that Mukurtu provides. Next are what we call community records. So we have extended community records for all types of material. And broadly, this is the ability to provide multiple sets of metadata or multiple records for any item and push back on the concept of a singular canonical record. We have a suite of tools that we collectively call round trip. These are workflows for import and export of metadata and media to allow for digital return and exchange with other communities and institutions. An important note on that front is all of our import-export uses open formats. It's not non-proprietary, so you're never locked into use of Mukurtu. We also support use of the traditional knowledge labels. TK labels allow Indigenous communities to provide more information about proper access and use of materials that are primarily in the public domain or owned by third parties. And finally, we have several avenues for language learning support, including good language representation through site-wide Unicode support, dictionary tools for more granular language work, connections between digital heritage and dictionary components within the site, and support for rich audio and video recordings across the Mukurtu site as well. So before I jump into the platform itself, I want to talk a little bit about where it came from so you can get an idea of our priorities and principles that helps shape not just the platform, but our commitment to the underlying philosophy. Basically, I find having a context of why Mukurtu works the way it does helps explain how it works. So Mukurtu grew out of collaborations that our director, Dr. Kim Christian, worked on with the Warramungu Aboriginal community in Central Australia. Starting in about 1995, Dr. Kristen was working with a group of Warramungu women. They'd invited her to record songs and stories about their homelands and traditions with the express intent of passing those recordings on to their children and their grandchildren. They specifically asked her to record audio and video of places where they were raised, stories of their ancestors, songs about the countries, their languages, and other materials as well. So that was in 1995. Skipping ahead in around 2002, those materials, along with other digital and digitized materials from scholars, missionaries, teachers, people who had passed through or lived in the community, started being returned to or shared with the community. So in the course of working with those digital and digitized files, it quickly became evident that those digital materials needed to be managed in similar ways to physical materials, following community protocols for viewing, circulation, and attribution. It's one thing if you're physically holding an object in the room and you know if it's appropriate for you to view it or not, but there was a sense that it's a bit different when it's digital files. And this photo really illustrates those physical protocols that we talked about, or that we talk about. So this is a filing cabinet. It's located at the Ninkanunu Art and Culture Center in Tennant Creek. We can clearly see that access is restricted, it's men's only, and that permission applies, and then also information on whom to contact to access the materials within it. So the question really was, how do we translate these face-to-face protocols to the permission and access of digital materials when they are removed from their physical context? Michael Jumpin Jones, who's an elder in the Warramungu community, was the main person working on this. And as the project developed, he chose to use the name Mukurtu for the digital access platform that he wanted to see created. Mukurtu literally translates as dilly bag in Warramungu, which is a traditional safekeeping place. So elders would keep sacred items in their bags. They had to open them to younger generations, and there's a dialogue for younger generations to ask and listen and learn. So a dialogue of keeping things safe, but also educating around appropriate usage. So the dilly bag represents a safekeeping place, and that was the starting point to create the first Mukurtu Wimparani Kari archive for the Warramungu community. Again, we're talking early 2000s, so the first version launched in 2007. It was only accessible in person on the center at the Ninkanunu Art and Culture Center. That was the very first version of Mukurtu. Moving ahead several years, enough people had heard about and were asking about Mukurtu that the platform was expanded from a single, unique offline tool to a more flexible web-based platform, which has continued to grow and is something that can be used by communities in different places. So our team has had the great privilege to work with many Indigenous, Native, First Nations communities as part of our community-driven development process, and their needs and feedback guide our development, refine our features, and drive our user support. So now I want to talk about the structure of a Mukurtu site. Each Mukurtu site has 3 elements that provide the framework that we use to create, share, and describe content. These 3 elements are communities, cultural protocols, and categories. We often call them the 3 Cs. I will go into each in more detail, but briefly, communities are the who of Mukurtu. They represent groups of contributors, groups of users, and identify where content and knowledge within a site comes from. Cultural protocols are the how of Mukurtu. They are how individual users access specific content provided by the contributors. Importantly, each Mukurtu community within a site will create and manage their own sets of protocols. And categories are the what of Mukurtu. They're descriptive terms. They help enable discovery of content. They're typically a fairly small set of common or vernacular terms that help the core site users find what they're looking for. So digging into each of those in a little bit more depth. Communities primarily represent the source or contribution of content within a site. For example, a community could be a group of language speakers, a nation, a clan, a family, or a repository holding material culture, or anything else really. A site can have as many Mukurtu, as many structural communities as needed. For example, a site run internally by a single tribe may only have a few communities if all the content is coming from their citizens. Or they could have communities that map to different contributing departments, say the education, language departments, tribal administration may be represented as individual communities within their own site. On the other end of the spectrum, the site can have many communities, especially if we look at the Australian sites. A lot of those will map to families. So we can have sites with hundreds of communities. I think the Warrnambool site is currently 250 odd families. So we have 250 odd structural communities. The site that I have up on the screen here, the Plateau People's Web Portal, it's a collaborative project and it currently includes 8 tribal nations. Each of those nations is represented as a community within the site. In this particular site, there are also non-native partner organizations, primarily federal repositories. They are also represented structurally as communities since they contribute to the site as well. They contribute their metadata, their media assets. We don't highlight them, in the same way on the front page of the site. I'm going to come back to this site a little bit more since it's a project that we maintain here at WSU, so I can speak well to the content and the structure of this particular site. Next are cultural protocols. And again, protocols are how individual users access specific content. We generally talk about protocols as types of sharing because setting protocols is not just about restricting access, rather it's about defining appropriate access. I like this example as well. So it's similar to the filing cabinet that we saw earlier. This is a physical example of a protocol. In this case, a display at a center in Australia was masked over until it could be replaced because a person featured in the photo had passed away, something that hadn't necessarily been planned for when it was first built. Protocols are really the heart and soul of Mukurtu. They are what allow for cultural values that exist offline to be embedded online in our digital system. Each Mukurtu community defines their own set of protocols. In the same way that communities are flexible, protocols are flexible as well. And some communities will have many, while others may only have a few. Some common protocols that we often see across Indigenous communities are gender-based, seasonal, so winter songs or winter stories, ceremonial or sacred protocols, and protocols for community members or tribal citizens. Other common uses for protocols are more workflow-oriented, like staging, review, staff use, vetting, so working with the materials before giving them a final access. And finally, if any items are going to be shared publicly, a public access or an open protocol needs to be created and used as well. That's not something that is the default setting. That's an intentional choice in the same way that a private protocol is. And the last important note right now about protocols is that each user will only be enrolled as a member in certain protocols. So different users will have different membership depending on what they should be able to access. And the last of our 3 Cs are categories. Again, categories define what is meaningful to users. They are a discovery tool to organize and define the materials within a Mukurtu site to help people search and browse for those materials. And again, in the same way that each Mukurtu site has unique communities and each community has unique protocols, each site is going to have a unique set of categories. We don't default to an existing set of controlled vocabularies since the scope and content and audience of sites varies so much from site to site. We find that most sites end up with around 10 to 15 categories depending on their content and their user needs. They're usually accessible terms, making an effort to avoid technical or academic jargon that we typically see in some of those other controlled vocabularies. Coming back to the Plateau People's Web Portal again, we have 12 categories on this particular site. In this case, the categories largely reflect topics or subjects or areas of interest. Some are fairly self-explanatory, artistry and artifacts, language. Other categories are more complex. For example, we have government to government relations, and that category mostly contains things like treaty documents, censuses, Bureau of Indian Affairs reports, and the tribal representatives who planned the site didn't just want to call those historical documents or government documents, and really felt that this term better reflects their sovereign nation-to-nation relationship with the US federal government. So together, the 3 Cs are flexible enough to adapt to most situations and are the foundation of every Mukurtu site. I'm just going to take a quick pause there and see if there's any burning questions in chat, and grab a quick drink before I move on. Some questions about technical, potentially technical needs and technical limitations. We can talk a little bit about implementation towards the end, but so I'm going to save that question for later. Don't let me forget about that one. All right. So now that we've looked at the structure of a Mukurtu site, we can talk about the content of a Mukurtu site. I find understanding the structure first is key because the 3 Cs will define how content is contributed and how users can discover and access it. So the main content on most Mukurtu sites is what we call digital heritage items. We do have other content like dictionary words, and I'll probably cover some of those a little bit later. Digital heritage items are at their core a combination of media and metadata, descriptive information about those media files. They move beyond the notion of one single canonical item or one record to allow for more complex context and relationships. And we're going to take a closer look at how we do that with community records again. Digital heritage items can be built around a wide range of media formats. Image, audio, video, documents are all supported. And the metadata schema that we use is an extended Dublin core schema that we call Mukurtu core. And at this point, I'm just going to jump over and show an item live because I think it's a little more interesting to look at it that way. Let me just zoom in here. So this is a digital heritage item on the Plateau People's Web Portal. Up at the top of the page, we have the title. It's a root gathering bag. Right below that, we can see there's 2 different records, 2 different community records within this one digital heritage item. The record that we're looking at right now is from the Northwest Museum of Arts and Culture, the MAC, over in Spokane, Washington. Beside it, we have a record from the Confederate Tribes of Warm Springs, which we're going to take a look at in a moment. But right now, everything that we're looking at has been provided by the museum. So they've given us the title. They have provided a photo of the basket from the records. They have included a short physical description, fairly straightforward, round twine cylindrical bag, hemp and cotton weft, and some other details about it. Moving into more of the metadata, we have over on the right, community, protocol, and category, the 3 Cs that I was just talking about. So in this case, both the museum and the tribe are represented as communities. They're both responsible for the creation of this record. The museum, because this is their catalog record metadata, this is their image, they physically hold the basket, and the Confederate Tribes of Warm Springs are represented because the basket was made by Warm Springs tribal members, so they are responsible for it, existing at all. Both of those communities have selected a protocol for access. In this case, they have both said that this item can be shared publicly. If that was not the case, if there was a conflict between the 2 protocols, we have tools in the system to manage that. It is in our artistry and artifacts category, and the rest of the metadata is fairly minimal. We have a general date range. We have a sort of culture group creator statement from the museum's rights statement, their identifier. So all in all, it's a fairly minimal record. It's not a problematic record, which sometimes we come across. But the reason this item is in the site and the reason all the items are in this particular site is that it was selected by tribal representatives because they said, well, we have something more that we want to say about that. And one of the ways we do that is through community records. So now I'm going to move over to the community record provided by the tribe. So the photo stays the same. That's not going to change. We're talking about the same basket, but the rest of our metadata is pretty much all going to be different. We have a more accurate title. It's a Wasco Man basket. The museum has probably hundreds of root gathering bags, but we have more information about this one. This record within the larger item is only attributed to the tribe. It's not attributed to the museum. In this case, it is still within a public access protocol. I should note, I'm not going to show anything today that's not publicly accessible, but we certainly have cases where one item will have multiple community records with different protocols. So different users may be able to view different parts of an item. Still in the artistry and artifacts category, but we have a more detailed set of keywords: Sally Bag, Deer Design, Wasco Man. We have 3 individuals listed as contributors. Maxine Switzler, Arlita Rowan, and Valerie Switzler are all tribal. We're all tribal members. 2 of them have since passed away, who are expert weavers, and they are the women who are responsible for creating the record that we're looking at right now. They've also selected a traditional knowledge attribution label, which we may take more a look at later if there's interest. And then in place of the basic physical description, they have provided a short textual cultural narrative, going into more detail about the design, the materials of the basket, and they're each individually attributed for their statements here. And then really bringing this record to life, they work together to create a short video. It's about 1.5 minutes. I'm going to take a moment to play it because it really illustrates this a lot better than listening to me does. Let me know if you can't hear the audio, but it should be set up properly once you get underway.
Waskopami wapani wapas mi wapas ukna chalatuni ni winch waskopam winch ku yamash stay with her base pani nakkanin khana one patat quaint Yamash yao chichini page. Why when ikuspa ania anakusmispa matumna nachna cheaters ikus koha winch and act conin hartash nuktki Yamashmi. Looking at this Sally Bag and just thinking about how important Wasco people thought of their men. And just like we're talking about the wedding veil, this is the kind of men that normally the family of a daughter would pick, somebody that's well trained to be a Wasco man and be caring, be able to care for his family and hunt for deer to put meat on the table, take care of his family.
So that was Arlita Rowan speaking primarily in Ichuskin, which is one of their languages. I like this example as a whole. It shows us protocols in place. It shows us community records, rich media, language representation, traditional knowledge labels, basically all those sort of core features that I mentioned up at the top. And now I'm going to move into just a couple other examples of content with some other ideas. So this is another example from the Plateau People's Web Portal. This is a collection, and in Mukurtu, a collection is just groups of items. So we can use them in different ways. I'm going to show more of those later, I believe. But this collection has 66 videos. They are created by the Confluence Project with Columbia River tribes in our region. One of the items within that collection is a video of Virginia Beavert speaking in Ichuskin about the importance of education. I believe she's done actually quite a series of videos. I'm not going to play these ones at the moment, but I'm just going to show some examples from it. In addition to the video within this record, Virginia and the Confluence team provided an interlinear transcription of the interview in both English and Ichuskin. The text is indexed in search. So if you're browsing for content and using the full text search, you can search in a language as well as in English in this case. I want to highlight some examples from some other sites as well. So some from the Hoona Heritage Foundation Digital Archives based up in Hoona, Alaska. Their collections focus on materials held at their offices in Juneau and Hoona. And when they built their site, they started by highlighting the most important and most frequently accessed materials, since they knew those would garner the most engagement. That's why we have categories for things like fishing, the Hoona Fire of 1944, military and veterans. Those are the items that are get frequent request and access within the archives. But as the site has developed over the years, more community members, as they felt comfortable, began to come forward to include their own materials in the site as well. In 1944, a fire burned down most of the Huna village. So photos and documentation from that time are in very, very high demand. There's a whole series of interviews with community members who were in Huna at the time. They have one here with Wynne Smith, which is a video that they're hosting through YouTube at this case, and they have an interview with her there. They also have made quite an effort to highlight and honor community members who served in the military, so they're service members and veterans. This record for Melvin Williams includes a photo. We can also see over on the right that there's other photos of Melvin, other items within the site, and we have direct connections between those. And in this case, further down the page, they chose to include an embedded SoundCloud file with an interview. So they've also typed the transcription of that. So again, ensuring that you can listen, read alongside, and have all of that indexed in search as well. Looking at some of these examples, I also wanted to highlight some ways that we've seen language incorporated, primarily indigenous language incorporated across Mukurtu sites. After all, language and cultural heritage are inextricably linked. So language work kind of needs to be sorted throughout. It's supported throughout. It's not one or the other. I think I alluded to this earlier. Mukurtu supports Unicode UTF-8 character encoding. So typically anywhere you can enter text, you should be able to work with any Unicode supported keyboards or characters. This is the Passamaquoddy people site. They've included right on their homepage a text and audio welcome.
Kulazi kopen, you'd best get more kadi mausu in work. Edley kisgakim so timuk.
As well as a more extensive welcome on their About page, contextualizing the collections and the materials in the Passamaquoddy language, their place, and the relationships with the neighboring tribes and ancestors. I'm not going to play any of these at the moment, but again, they've broken up into smaller clips to have alongside the text there. This is back on the Plateau People's web portal. So this is what we call a multi-page document that's being used to share language learning resources from the Coeur d'Alene tribe over in Idaho. This here is one of their core language books that their language department uses in their language classes. So they've digitized this. There's actually quite a lot going on in this page. Let me break it down a little bit. So first, what they did up at the top is they scan each double spread of the book, and we see those up at the top in sort of a carousel or a gallery that you can click through to move from page to page. Then on each page that we're looking at, we have the actual pages of the book and corresponding audio files. So users, again, primary language learners, can listen to the audio recordings that correspond with the pages of the text that they're looking at as they browse. This is just another view of the same page, but we're seeing the player for the audio recording. It's not too different. This is actually another Coeur d'Alene item. So this is the 1935 recording of Lawrence Nicodemus, who was a Coeur d'Alene tribal member, reading a story, Cricket Rides Coyote. Actually, I can just play a brief moment of this clip in a second. The item itself is fairly straightforward, but I'm going to highlight the related items over on the top right there in a moment. But let's hear a few moments of the clip.
Cricket Rides Coyote. Quando depois meio,
and that's after extensive cleanup. So that's a heavily processed audio file. So what the tribe did with that, what the language department did, is they recently re-recorded the Cricket Rides Coyote story with Coeur d'Alene language department staff. And then they had students create animations to accompany the story. And they made a whole series of those. Again, I'll just play a brief moment of that as well. So in that case, not only are they working with the historical, the legacy recordings, they are also working with current community members to continue to expand and build on those. And then the last sort of specific language-oriented things I want to show is the dictionary tools.
And just ponder your favorite, doesn't.
So we developed a dictionary tool because the digital heritage items, the metadata and display of those, just wasn't meeting the needs of our language educators and learners at sort of a more granular level there. This is the dictionary page, again, on the Plateau People's web portal, showing the Coeur d'Alene language. So at the top, we have options to filter by language, by keywords, parts of speech, build out word lists. And there's also the option to filter or browse by sort of first letter. You can see down sort of in the middle of the page that we're working with, some non-English characters as well, and those are represented fairly well here. In the actual results for our search, we have, in this case, we're getting the words in language, followed by an English translation where that's provided. And in this case, also a recording of the word and the name of the speaker who provided the recording for those. So I'm just going to change over to one more thing. The last feature that I want to show is what we call person records. So our users wanted to be able to have things like biographies and have better ways to aggregate content within a site about an individual person. So in many cases, we see these effectively serving as an individual's collection. So I think there's a lot of potential work here, a fair bit of overlap potential with oral history and that type of work. So this is a person record for Day Frank Jacamara from the Warramungu community in Australia. Front and center on the page, we have a photo of Day Frank. Over on the right, we can see that some of his family members are listed as well. So again, in this site, family relationships are really important. So people are using this to identify family connections. People have also used this related people feature to identify other types of connections like master-apprentice relationships and things like that. As we scroll down the page, a lot of these community members will have biographies that they either wrote themselves or they dictated to other community members, and those are included here. Most of these are going to incorporate a mix of the text biography, photos, or other media. Some mostly photos, but some have videos that they created in the last couple of years as well. And then finally, below that, towards the end of the page, we get to an aggregation of all of the digital heritage items where actually all of the content within the site, whether it's digital heritage or dictionary or other pieces, where those individuals are represented. So again, connections to other photos, interviews, and things like that. There is a lot more possible within Mukurtu, but if you're interested in learning more, first off, I would encourage you to reach out to our support email. That pretty much goes to me, support@mukurtu.org, if you have any questions. Additionally, all of our support documentation and training resources are publicly available, everything from how to get started to how to work with specific kinds of content, import, export, basically anything that is supported in Mukurtu is documented and shared on our support site. And then additionally, our main site at mukurtu.org has a lot of information about the platform. FAQs, a public showcase of selected sites, information on accessing our demo sandbox, and sort of how to go about getting Mukurtu if that's something you're interested in as well. Thank you so much for your time as I talk through that. I do have other things that I can pull up, so I certainly have some other live demonstrations of features. I think there were some questions in chat about taking a look at the back end. We can absolutely do that. I can share other sites. But I wanted to stop there and open up for any questions. If not, we'll go through the chat log and see what we have there. I'm not sure if, I guess for either Amy or Beth, do you want me to mediate questions, or is that something y'all want to?
You can take questions.
Okay, perfect. Okay, there are some in chat. We can go through them. Looks like Veronica, you've raised your hand. So let's start with that. Someone has an immediate question.
Hello, I'm so excited for this. I've heard about Mukurtu even like, I want to say 10 years ago, maybe, when it was first sort of penetrating the Great Lakes tribal scene. So one thing, this is going to seem like, I don't know if this is a good question for everybody, but I'm working actively with my tribe and other tribes right now. One of them is a museum project. We have a collection of incredible old ash baskets, and the elders who understand the stories behind those baskets and the elders who created them are, are an endangered group, I guess, maybe, if that's the right way to say it. They're getting older and we're losing our elders fast. That's what I'm trying to say. So I wondered if there was any, granting organization that you've worked with a lot that you think works especially well with you and with tribes, or, that sort of gets it.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess so. So the IMLS, the NEH have both funded many community projects that make use of Mukurtu. So I'm IMLS being the Institute for Museum and Library Services, NEH being the National Endowment for the Humanities. I don't recall the specific grant programs within that offhand. They have done a lot. We have also seen support for Mukurtu related sites in the past through the NSF, the National Science Foundation, typically around that's more around language documentation. They tend to focus a bit more on that. I know we've done some work with the Mellon Foundation. I don't know if they've done any specific smaller sites, but they certainly have an interest there as well. Those are the ones that come to mind. And if you want to reach out, I can tell you exactly which grant programs within those agencies we've worked with. I know folks have also been able to get some state levels, like Washington State, the Secretary of State has something, you know, along those lines as well. That's for direct funding for efforts like that. So
okay, thank you.
You bet. Okay, I'm going to start going back through folks' questions in chat and see what questions come up from there. But certainly feel free to keep adding or raise your hand and we'll jump in. So let me just read through this. So Michelle Sullivan had a question earlier, and maybe you want to explain this quicker than me reading it. But you were asking about how some of these projects have had to compromise because of technological limitations. You had a similar platform built using WordPress and other elements and couldn't meet all the technical requirements. So let me talk a little bit. I can go back and share my screen to pull some examples as we work through more of these questions. Talk a little bit about sort of what the implementation of Mukurtu looks like for context there. So like I mentioned, we do the code development in-house here at WSU. So we are now the body that writes the code. So in terms of technical implementation there, you know, getting the platform built, it's kind of what, you know, it's kind of on us. But there's a lot to think about when you think about implementing a site or customizing a site, you know, if you have one built. Basically, there's two ways for somebody to get a Mukurtu site. One is, since we make the code base open source and accessible, if an organization has the capacity, both the technical infrastructure and the personnel, so you know the system administrators necessary to run a web server and run what's called a Drupal instance, they can take the code base, go to from our GitHub repository, install it, run it on their own, and you know, do development from there. So that's one possibility, is if folks have the internal technical resources, they can do it on their own. The other option, which we see quite a bit, is for one reason or another, either don't have the internal capacity or interest to do so, you can pay a third-party vendor to host the site. But in terms of sort of where Mukurtu fits into that, Mukurtu, the platform, is, you know, sort of built and functional. Typically, it's not something that we've seen to date, people doing heavy technical customization around. It works out of the box. It's not something that needs a lot of development work to, you know, make happen. So to some of your other questions there, Michelle, about sort of how things are presented, we have, you know, we've customized our own metadata fields and our own display the way that we built the system, and we can sometimes help folks with working with that on their own site. So feel free to chime in if you want to get into more detail on those specific questions, but that's a pretty big bucket. The next couple questions, we have one from Andy. Can we share some views of the system backend? Yes, we're gonna do that right now. Karen had asked how easy it is for folks to use the platform and add their own content. I'm gonna answer that briefly as well at the moment. So I'm gonna show what it looks like for people to add their own content and take a look at the backend view at the same time. So we can get both of those. But in terms of, does our staff add content? The short answer is no. So kind of what I was just saying, we make the platform available. Typically, we don't actually host sites for people. There's a small number of sites like the Plateau People's Web Portal that our center does host, but typically we make it available. It's for people to manage the actual installation and management on their own. So not only do we not have access to people's sites, we actually don't track downloads of the code base or installations. I don't actually know how many Mukurtu sites are out there. I mean, I have some numbers, but we don't want to be a barrier to people using the platform. So we don't monitor that. Is an important thing to keep in mind. Let's take a quick look at the sort of back end of a site. Right now, what I'm logged into here is Mukurtu demo. This is our public sandbox site. So if anybody would like to see what Mukurtu looks like, you can request a user account here, and I'll get that set up for you as well. What I'm going to do right now is I'm going to create or sort of walk through the creation of a digital heritage item. Again, we do have tools to do this through, I think I mentioned earlier, round trip, so import, export. But at the moment, let's do it through the web interface. So depending on your individual user role, and again, we have quite a suite of user permissions, you'd have different options available here. The account that I'm using has the ability to create a digital heritage item. I can go ahead and do that. And currently, there's basically two elements to this digital heritage item screen. The main one is what we're seeing in the center of the screen here. These are our 5 metadata tabs. We've sort of broken our metadata fields up into 5 groups, just so it's not one giant long form. It's a little easier to tab through them. And then over on the right, we also have a media library. So typically what we see, the workflow is you will upload your media file into your media library, then you'll build a digital heritage item around it. So let me go ahead and upload a file, and we can take a look at that. I'll upload an image just so it'll go quick. And of course, we have all this documented on our support site as well. I'm just going to upload this thumbnail image to keep it simple. In this case, I'm uploading one image file. You could do multiple images at once. Again, you can also import audio and other things as well. Go ahead. I'm just going to finish this process off. Okay. Because mostly what I want to do with that is say, great, I can take this image and I can go ahead and drop it into my digital heritage item. You can have multiple files within an item. So I showed some examples earlier where we had both image and audio within one item, and we can do multiple media files here. So in terms of our metadata, we have a couple fields that you have to fill out. First is title. I'm just going to go ahead and call this a Mukurtu sample item, but you would be pulling the title from your records or the name of your interview or whatever you're working with from there. All the fields that you have to fill in are going to be marked with an asterisk. So everything needs a title. Not every field, not every item needs a summary. A summary is basically a really short description. Whether you want to highlight the specific topics or something else, there's space for a longer description as well. But we would have our title. I already include my media asset. See if that displays when I save it or not. Every item, again, going back to our 3 C's, we have to have communities, protocols, categories. So in this case, my user account is only part of one community. So I'm going to say this item is coming from my Mukurtu demo community. Then within that community, I'm going to choose the relevant protocol. So earlier I set up a public access and a community only protocol. I'm going to put this in my public access protocol for the moment. If we needed multiple communities and protocols, we'd be able to do that here as well. And I'm going to put this in my training category as an example. The other fields that we have on this particular page, we have a creator field. Nice thing about a number of these fields is it will prompt you for terms you've already used. So I know that I'm going to be putting this under my own name, but it says, hey, as I start typing my name, is this the individual I mean? If not, I can always go ahead and add another term or add a new term into these fields. Got our creator, contributor, and then some options, for date fields as well. Original date, and then also some descriptive date. I'm not just going to go through every metadata field right now. I'm just going to sort of hit on the highlights, and if people have more questions, we can come back to them. So basically, we have some core information on this Mukurtu Essentials tab. The Mukurtu Core tab is where we see the sort of longer descriptive fields. So from the Wasco Man basket that I showed earlier, we had the museum information in a description field. We had the video actually embedded in this traditional knowledge field. So these fields will support media as well as text. And then we had the sort of textual narratives from the Weavers in Mukurtu Core field. We have a rights and permissions section. This is where we would apply things like traditional knowledge labels or Creative Commons licensing, or including other rights statements, as relevant. Additional metadata is where we would see most of our institutional metadata. So things like extent, a unique identifier, identifying the languages, present in the recording, subject headings. We actually have a people field that's distinct from the creator and contributor. So if somebody is spoken about in a recording, we could list them as they're not really the interviewee or the interviewer. They might be listed as people because they're featured in it. We have space for a very basic text transcription, and we can talk. I think folks will probably have questions about transcription stuff. We can do a little bit of geocode mapping and things like that. So that's basically what it looks like to create an item within the site. And hopefully that gives a bit of context for sort of how it is to use the site, at least in terms of content creation there. I'm having trouble with images right now on my little sandbox. So I might have to nudge this a bit later, but there we go. It's playing nice now. So I'm just going to keep skimming through the previous chat questions as well. So Emmanuel is asking for family access and things restricted. How does it work? Do folks get different logins? In terms of confidentiality, can information be accessed by the police, et cetera? It's mainly secure. So in terms of how do folks access content? Yes, you do need a user account to log in. If you remember from earlier, I was saying that we have communities and protocols, and that's how we define where material is coming from and who has access. So within each protocol, there's a series of different user roles. And basically you can say, hey, for a certain protocol, does a user account have permission to view the item? Do they have permission to edit the items? Things like that. So what will happen is somebody will have a user account to log into the site, and then they'll have relationships to those different protocols, which will specify exactly which material they can both access, what they can edit, what they can create. So very, very granular user access, but yes, basically based around different logins. In terms of confidentiality, can information be accessed by police, et cetera? So Mukurtu is based on the Drupal web platform. So in terms of sort of web security, we follow the best practices around that. So provided you're working with a hosting provider that you trust, things are typically stable. We release security updates and all that there. Again, we are not the organization that hosts sites, so nobody can come to us asking for access to a site. That's not something that we would ever be able to provide. So that might be more of a matter of, your individual site administration. Okay, let's see. And apologies if I miss anybody's questions. So Wesley, you were asking a new version of Drupal. So yes, I mentioned that Mukurtu is built on Drupal. A new version of Drupal is coming out later the next year or so. How easy is it for users to upgrade to the new Drupal platform? So without getting too much into our technical weeds here, the current version of Mukurtu that's available, Mukurtu 3, is built on Drupal 7. As you noted, there are new versions of Drupal coming out. Currently, they're working on Drupal 9 and 10 as sort of the next versions there. We are in basically everything that our development team is doing right now is rebuilding what Mukurtu to work on the current versions of Drupal. So Mukurtu 4 will release on Drupal probably 10 by the time our development is done. And again, without getting too technical right now, Drupal 7 to 8. So Mukurtu 3 to 4 is a big jump. It's totally different. So we're actually redeveloping everything from the ground up and doing that. We're going to have all the same features and functionality, but the backend will be different. In terms of if somebody is using Mukurtu right now, once we release Mukurtu 4, what that's going to look like is they would need to create a new Mukurtu site, a new Mukurtu 4 site on the current version of Drupal. And then within that, we are going to have some tools to help migrate content. So basically saying, we haven't finished the tool yet, but to the effect of in your new site, you enter your credentials for your old site, and it will hopefully guide you through the process to say, okay, there's some decisions you're going to have to make about how maybe metadata fields or protocols work a bit differently, but it'll effectively map your content and migrate it over for you or with you. Again, we're still building those tools, so I can't give too many details, but there will be a process to migrate. Unless somebody has done, true customization, it should be very well supported, and our support team will be, on hand to help folks with that. So it'll be not an upgrade in place; it's upgrade or install a new version and migrate content over. But there will be support for it, absolutely. Thanks, Leslie. Christina is asking, did I indicate that Mukurtu has a preservation function, or is it purely for sharing and access? So Mukurtu is focused on access. What I said is that ideally it serves best as one piece of sort of a larger digital ecosystem. So for a handful of reasons, Mukurtu is an access platform. And what I mean by that is I'm making a distinction here between preservation files, preservation master, sometimes you'll hear, which would be things like the original recordings, high resolution WAV files, high resolution TIFF files, things like that. Mukurtu is not really designed to handle those. It's focused more on our access copies. So smaller size MP3s, smaller size JPEG files, PDF, things like that. For a couple of reasons, mainly cost of storage. If you are already maintaining those files in a digital preservation system, you're not duplicating them, or you're not having more copies. Ease of access is another one. A lot of our core users have limited either bandwidth or limited internet access. So the actual functionality of delivering those preservation materials is pretty tricky. So we focus again on access for like good user experience, basically. And sometimes people don't want to make the high resolution files available even to their trusted users. There's always concerns about, well, if somebody has the high resolution image, they can blow it up or publish it. So they choose to, focus on providing access copies for viewing, and then saying, hey, if you do need access to the original preservation materials, contact us and we can sort that out. So short answer, no, Mukurtu doesn't have those preservation capacities built in. It's something that we always talk about working alongside, and I can certainly point towards resources for sort of digital preservation that are out there if folks want to learn more about that. And Michelle's asking, these projects adhere to design. I'm not familiar with design justice principles as a specific thing. If you want to run that by me, I can give a bit more information, but I'm not familiar with those principles offhand, unfortunately. I think we're caught up on chat questions. So does anyone else in the audience have anything they would like to ask, either through chat or feel free to unmute and ask a question over audio as well.
I'm not sure exactly how to state my question.
Please do.
So bear with me. So I'm limited in my staffing at this time, working on building our department.
Absolutely.
So is this something that can be figured out with limited staffing? Would it just probably take longer and all of those things?
Sure.
I have resources for some things, but
yeah, absolutely. So are you asking more about the capacity for sort of the technical implementation, or like the day-to-day actually putting content in and managing users, or both? I mean,
yes.
Both probably, right?
A little bit of both.
Yeah.
I think I would have the ability to resource like IT and remedy that part of it, because I've had a similar process, but so maybe it's the other part that I'm more interested in.
Yeah, and I'll just repeat what I said earlier about the hosting side. Yeah, contact IT. If you contact our support, I can give you the specifics to send them. Say, hey, here's the technical requirements. Can you do that? Can certainly point in that direction. Other option being pay a third-party vendor to host the site for you. In which case, there's a cost either way. It's just whether you're paying staff or paying a third party. But in terms of using the site sort of day to day, there's going to be some amount of, especially sort of intellectual work up front in planning your site. So figuring out your communities and protocols, categories, how you want to build collections. And most of that work, again, to some extent, you're going to want to do up front, but it'll continue to evolve. But none of that requires really much in the way of technical experience. That's really about planning, following our support resources. All of the front end doing stuff on the site is kind of what I just showed, and creating an item. That's about as complex as it gets as far as what steps to follow. So on that side, you're pretty good in terms of what types of staff you would need. Where it might get a little more complicated is if you say want to focus on preparing material in spreadsheets and importing it en masse from there. Totally doable, totally thing that we support, but you're going to want to make sure that you're working with folks who are comfortable working in those other systems. Working with spreadsheets, if you already have an inventory somewhere, great, that's a phenomenal place to start, and you can kind of turn that into records. If you need to also do the digitization, so if you're working, if you only have analog materials at the moment, you're certainly going to need to plan for that. So depending on where you are, you'll have a different set of needs. If all your material is digitized and at least minimally described, from the time you get a site installed to putting content in, you can do that in 5, 10, 15 minutes, realistically, to get your first item in. But you're going to want all the planning around it to make sure that you have your description and everything else. So it kind of depends on where you are with inventory description management. Does that help?
Yes, thank you. That's very encouraging.
Awesome. I know folks had hands up. I'm going to go back to chat because it looks like I skipped a couple questions earlier. Winona, to your question about is there more in-depth training or mentoring? We don't have any programs for training. Again, all of our support documentation, videos, how to is on our support site, but you can also contact, basically contact support, contact me, and we do a lot of remote training and support. Typically, most of that is free if it's something that we can address remotely, but we don't have a structured mentoring program. Depending on where you're located, we do have a couple what we call Mukurtu hubs. Thanks. Basically, people who can provide support more locally than what we do here at WSU. So we have one at UCLA. In California, one with Wills in Wisconsin. Our Eastern one used to be based out of the Yale Divinity School in Connecticut, University of Oregon, University of Hawaii, Manoa, and University of Technology, Sydney in New South Wales, Australia. Oh, and we're also starting one with the Central Council of Tlingit and Haida up in Alaska. So that information is on our site as well, should you want to try and connect with somebody more local to you for possibly more support than what you get from us generally. But yeah, no explicit mentoring training, but we do provide a whole lot of remote user support for folks. So I would certainly reach out to our support. And Brett was asking, can we share some examples of Mukurtu sites that are being used to provide access to Indigenous oral history storytelling collections? All of the sites that I can share publicly are going to be listed. If you go to Mukurtu.org, we have a showcase section. So again, we don't actually index all the sites. I don't know all the Mukurtu sites that are out there. Many of them are, community internal or otherwise private. But all the folks listed here have said we can at least share their sites publicly. So I would start looking at those. But otherwise, typically what we'll see is oral history storytelling is often, for the majority of our users, is kind of integrated with everything else in the same way that we don't have, I was trying to say, we don't have the cultural heritage and we have the language. They are, all the way throughout. So we often will see sites that have, smaller oral history or storytelling elements within their larger collections they're working with as well. So I would start with the sites listed in our showcase and go from there. I think I was skipping. Some folks had their hands raised, and I didn't know who that. I didn't notice who did. It looks like Veronica. Did you have another question?
Yes, another quick question. So, with the museums that I work with, they generally use Past Perfect,
Sure.
And obviously, there's so much work has been done to get that even, at all relevant. So I wonder, could we import from Past Perfect and populate?
Short answer, yes.
Yes.
It's been a little while since I've poked at Past Perfect myself, but it should let you do some. You want it in a spreadsheet. So if you can get some kind of report in a spreadsheet or something, we can generally help you do the sort of crosswalk and get it converted from there. So short answer, yes, you certainly can.
Thank you. Awesome. Thanks.
You bet. Did anybody else in chat have hands up that I missed?
Yeah, this is Karen Brewster. I had a question.
Please.
Somebody else in the chat also kind of asked, it's part related to mine. I'm still don't quite understand the relationship between you guys at WSU and the developers and an organization that wants to use this
Sure.
platform, and who does what and how that all works. And then, as somebody else asked, is there a cost to it?
Great question. Okay, coming back to the implementation side of things, I will say for anyone who wants to review this later, our FAQs do list this pretty well in terms of how much does it cost, things like that. But to sum up, so yes, we are the developers here at WSU. We make the source code available. It is open source. It is free. It is free. It's free like a puppy, not like a free lunch. So we make the source code available. Anybody can take it and work with it, but there will be, a cost on that end to implement. So in terms of, you do not have to pay anything to us at WSU to license or access the software, but you will need to figure out what the cost will be for the actual technical implementation. I started mentioning this when I was answering Naomi's question earlier, but basically there's sort of two ways that we see that shaking out for most people. One is if you work for an organization that has the relevant capacity to manage the site. So we mentioned that earlier, it's a Drupal site. You need a web server. It has Apache and Java and all those things on it. There's going to be both the physical component, the physical server hardware, and the IT staff who can install and maintain that. In that case, the cost is whatever you need to pay your IT staff and whatever they tell you they need in terms of hardware and equipment. So that cost would be borne internally, but again, no cost to us to license or use it. It's always the source code is free, always will be. Sometimes you might see that borne through a partner organization. So, some tribes, for example, have been able to partner with local land-grant universities who have an MOU of some sort and say, great, our IT department can offer those services as, as support for that work, or some other type of partnership. So either your own personnel and hardware, or an organization that you partner with. Second option is saying we don't have that capacity internally, but you can pay a third-party web vendor to do it. So on our Get page, we've mentioned one here. They're called Reclaim Hosting, but any vendor who can host a Drupal site can, in theory, host a Mukurtu site. And again, then in terms of the cost, it's whatever they're going to charge you for that. And typically, what that looks like is they'll keep the lights on. They will ensure that the web server is up and running, but they're not going to be on hand to help you import content or manage the front end or users. They're not Mukurtu experts, but they can keep the infrastructural piece running. Typically, so the cheapest you could get for something like that with Reclaim would start at about $100 a year. Realistically, I'd look towards one of their higher plans just in terms of sort of site capacity. So that starts at about $600-700 a year. But that's something that if you already have an IT vendor or a web vendor, lots of folks start there and say, hey, could we add on a platform like this? And again, we have information, we can share information on sort of what that looks like. So in terms of cost, nothing for Mukurtu itself, but you're going to be paying one way or another, or somebody's going to be paying for the implementation, whether that is in your staff time and your own technical resources, or paying a vendor to do that same work. And then you're responsible for managing sort of the front end of it, where the content goes, what it looks like, and all the description there.
Well,
does that answer that a little bit more clearly?
Yeah, well, I was actually thinking more on sort of the design end. You have all these fields and pages and everything sort of set up as a standard template. Are there opportunities for changing that if a organization has their own things they want, and then you do that for them? If they don't, I understand if you have your own tech support, you can play with it, but if you don't.
Yeah, that's a great question. This is actually going to be hopefully a substantial shift between Mukurtu 3 now and Mukurtu 4. Basically, we support stock Mukurtu. So if somebody wants to do customization, changing the look and feel, changing the metadata fields, we can give some information, but we can't directly support it. That's just outside our capacity to actually help with true customization. Now, that's something that will be better supported in the future, because newer versions of Drupal will make that easier to do in a sustainable way. So typically that's not stuff that we can directly support, just given well, it makes things a lot more complicated. If you change things, we're not necessarily sure how that interacts with the Mukurtu core. So typically, no, that's not something that we directly help with. There is a range of stuff in terms of, say, look and feel that we do have support for. We have a little section in our support documentation about things that we do support and how to do that all through the front end, but anything that would require, actually changing the source code or the design files is typically outside of what we are able to provide support for.
Thank you.
You bet. Okay, I think that's all the questions from chat. I don't think I've missed any others. Anyone else have something they would like to ask or see? And again, I can certainly show more as well if that's of interest. If not, I've got one or two other things I can mention, because I believe there had been some interest in where does Mukurtu fit alongside other oral history platforms. Amy, maybe that's where you're headed.
Yeah, no, that would be great. And it would be great if you could just demonstrate a little bit what it's like to search a collection.
Oh, for sure. Absolutely.
I think that's also something that comes up when you're looking at it across platforms.
Definitely. Why don't I do that first before I forget? So I'm going to go back over to our Plateau People subportal again, big rich site with lots of stuff. We have a few different ways to sort of get into the materials of a site. The most common that folks work with is our sort of main browse page. So what we see here is I'm not logged into the site. I'm currently visiting anonymously. I can see all of the content in the site that I have permission to access. So since I'm not logged in, anything that's marked public, anything that's under a public access protocol. If I log in, I will see more items. But this page shows me everything that I have access to view. I can do a full text search within that, and I'll show that in a second. I can change the order that I'm seeing my results in. We do a lot with facet filtering. So again, the site has 8 nations, a whole bunch of repositories. You can say, just show me the stuff from a certain community, things from a certain collection. I'm going to show more about collections in a moment, category, etc. So we can search, we can filter. I'm just going to do a quick search. Oh, goodness. A quick search for the item that I pulled up earlier, but I can do some others. But again, this is great if your users want to explore on their own. It's literally look for what you want. And sometimes things like categories, or we have a keywords field as well, are helpful in telling folks where to start. Sometimes you get to a segment like, I don't really know what to look for. And that's why we have some of those fields. But we have a full text search here. And I'm actually going to reset this and show. And we have other ways to access this too. But again, here's our list of 12 categories on the site. So I can say, hey, I know I'm interested in something language related. It'll refine my results. I can search within those. We can filter by the type of media. So if I know I'm looking for a video or an audio interview, I can include my my filters there. Keywords, again, keywords are like basically the same as it's like a folksonomy. It's smaller sets of categories typically. So again, you can see a list of certain fields so you can get a sense of what terms are being used. So a few different ways to search and refine those results. If you are working with any map data, let me see, this might take a minute to load up. While the map is loading up, because there's a map view, so you can view items on a map. Another tool that we have, and I alluded to this, is what we call collections. So in Mukurtu terms, a collection is a group of items. It's a curated group of items. Sometimes people will use those to represent, existing archival or physical collections. We have this donor collection. It has boxes and series and folders, but we can also use it, and that's what we have here, for example, the Mukurtu collection at Washington State University. This is our way of saying, hey, if you can't come see it in person, but you want to get a sense of how it's physically arranged, we've brought those together here. But you can also use it to bring together materials that aren't physically housed together. We see lots of folks doing born digital collections. We're doing an exhibit on basketry. I'm not going to break that up. If we have stuff from multiple different repositories, we'll display all those together. So we can use collections to give context and a little more structure, in addition to the sort of go to the browse page and search, which can be overwhelming. So collections for structure, search alongside things like categories for, the sort of open world experience. And then I was just going to show, again, we have mapped functionality. So if items have a map location attached with them, again, we can still search and refine, but it's just going to show me the items that have a location on the map. I think most of the ones out here are from a delegation visit many years ago. Anyway, so there's that ability as well for folks to do a little bit of map related work. So the other thing you were mentioning, Amy, is all right, how does it work with other, or how does it compare to other platforms? And I think the main ones you mentioned were OHMS and Aviary, sorry.
Yeah. And maybe
Yeah.
Omeka too, like how is this different from Omeka? Because I think those are the main tools people would be sort of deciding between.
Yeah, absolutely. It's actually great that you mentioned Omeka because so I haven't worked with Omeka, or sorry, I've done some work with Omeka. I haven't worked in depth with OHMS, although I have seen it demoed. I haven't worked with Aviary myself, but I've looked into it a little bit. Omeka, out of those few, is probably the most similar to Mukurtu. It is a content management system. What I'll say is, so it does a lot of similar things that Mukurtu does. You create individual pieces of content. You can build exhibits or collections. It has plugins to do all sorts of stuff with. Where it's a bit different is it is a little more focused on what we would see in terms of sort of archive management in a lot of ways. So it tends to use more of the language from that. It doesn't have the same granularity of access that Mukurtu does. So again, the things that set us apart, going back to like my very first slide, cultural protocols. So granular access, individual users, specific content. Lots of systems have some type of access controls, but it's typically, is it public or is it not public? Most don't have much more nuance than that. So Mukurtu, that's a big difference there in terms of individual access to content. Community records, you know, Omeka says, here's the item, here's the record, here's your fields to work with. Great, and that's the way we typically do things. But with Mukurtu, again, we have multiple records within a given item. So there is a fair degree of similar functionality, but different approaches, again, sort of different concepts beside them. OHMS, as I understand it, is something that doesn't have as much of the sort of end user exhibit. It's something you would typically do your work in OHMS and then pull that into somewhere else to display it. So the reason I have this screen up here is Omeka has an OHMS plugin. So you can do your time coding and your indexing, et cetera, in OHMS, and there'll be a way to pull the OHMS viewer into your Omeka site. We are planning to do something similar. That'll be part of our Mukurtu 4 development. We are planning integration with OHMS. We're not actively working on that yet. We're not quite at that phase of the development, but that is something on our roadmap. So potentially, so hopefully in the future, we would see the ability to bring in those OHMS tools into Mukurtu sites. You can, so again, apply our concepts of protocols and TK labels and community records to materials generated through the sort of various suite of OHMS tools there. And then as I understand it, for Aviary, a big difference with Aviary is it's all through them. So they are the platform, they are the vendor. You don't have your own site. I don't think that you can do anything outside of it. So I haven't worked with it in more, to know the specifics of it. But that's a big difference. And again, in terms of sort of OHMS, you do your work and you display it typically in another system, though I think OHMS has some degree of discovery, or at least you can do that. I think Aviary is kind of all self-contained. So you'd be, paying them directly to use it, whereas OHMS is, technically open source as well. So you could make use of their tools, but the implementation is a little bit more on your end in a similar way that, that Mukurtu is. Hopefully that's enough of a comparison that I can give there.
Yeah, thank you. If people have follow-up questions, feel free, but that's helpful.
Yeah. And so you had note, Amy, about timeline for Mukurtu 4. We're still a little ways out at this point. I get in trouble with our developers when I try to give timelines. We were hoping to see it this fall. I suspect it may be a bit later than that. At this point, we've been working on it for a little while, but kind of a nice thing is that Drupal has extended support for Drupal 7. It no longer has a hard end of life support. They're kind of assessing it every couple of years, which means that we are not in a panic. People will have more time to plan and migrate. So yeah, so I suspect early next year, but that is very much an estimate at this point. That we are certainly doing a lot of active work on it at this point. So yeah. Does anyone else have questions or information they would like to see or anything else in there?
Cora has a hand.
Please.
Hi, thank you. First of all, I'm so excited to see this work and that you've created something like this. I work with World Arts West we're centered in the San Francisco Bay Area, and we work with cultural artists, mostly dancers, and provide program services for them. And we're working on building an archive for our organization. And what we would like is something like this. It's like a living archive that we can share with the community to see the performances that we've done, to see oral histories that we've taken, things like that. So this is amazing to see. Thank you so much. I'm sorry, also having trouble forming my question, but you talked about earlier that this works in conjunction with other tools. Is this what you were talking about, the platforms that you just shared with, or are there other things that we might want to have in place if we're going to try to use this program?
Yeah. Oops, sorry, what to do. What I was mentioning earlier, give me one moment, is so Mukurtu doesn't currently have any like direct plugins for other stuff. It's fairly self-contained. But what I was talking about is digital preservation. So how do you keep your original files? How do you maintain them? For now, for the future, as a backup, etc. So I was saying, Mukurtu isn't the space for those. I'm going to drop this link in chat. So we don't have any like direct plugins for systems like that. But it's important to plan for that as well, because that will probably have some type of IT cost, et cetera. So the site that I have up right now, this is the Sustainable Heritage Network. It's actually another program that we maintain through our department here. And what I have here is one of our collections about an introduction to digital preservation. So this kind of covers the basics on what do you need to plan for? What does it mean to have, multiple copies of your files? How do you generate your access copies from there? What do you need to do to monitor those files? So I don't want to dive too much into that today, but feel free to contact Mukurtu support. I can direct you to other folks who can answer those questions. But this is a good start on some of that stuff. And this was primarily put together by my colleague, Lotus Norden-Wisla, who has done a lot of work with this. Other resources would be the Digital Power organization has a lot of resources for preservation, sort of for under-resourced organizations. We may probably reference some of their stuff in here as well. So yeah, what I was talking about is have a plan for those original digital materials, and then you choose what from that goes into your access platform later down the road. Yeah,
absolutely. Thank you so much. Those are great resources.
Fantastic. I see one more question up in chat. How much design control do you have over the website? Is there much flexibility in terms of aesthetic? I alluded to this a little bit earlier. Right now, it's not the easiest to sort of customize look and feel. You really would have to dig into the design files to do that. We are with the Mukurtu 4 development, that should be much better. It's going to be much more in line with the normal Drupal theming. So hopefully, Drupal themes will apply and stuff like that. So in theory, given that it's open source, it is open for you to work with, but the actual ease of doing it right now is somewhat more limited, with improvements coming. To answer that question over in chat. You bet. Okay. Just checking to see if I've missed it. So I think if we're sort of tapering out of questions, seems like, again, I'm certainly happy to answer more if they come up, but I would just sort of again mention support@mukurtu.org. MOOK-oo-too.org, that's where all of our support documentation is. You can contact us through there. Again, links to both our hubs and spokes. A little bit of information about MOOK-oo-too 4. Most of what I've shown is going to be available on there, as long as some other webinars and other stuff we've given in the past.
Thank you so much, Michael. This is
You
really,
bet.
really helpful. I'm so excited to see what all the people who access this training today will do with it and how it spreads through our community. So I think you can expect to hear from lots of oral historians in the coming months and years about how to use this tool.
That's fantastic. That's what we're here for. So yes, certainly please reach out with questions. We're always here to answer them, and can follow up. Yeah, email, more, Zoom calls and all that is a lot of what we do these days.
And hi to your baby.
Yeah, we have twins who are just waking up from a nap. So
Oh gosh.
we're a little bit cranky.
Oh. All right. Thank you, everyone. And thank you to Bethany and the OHA team for making this possible. And to our interpreters, please spread the word about this. The recording will be available on the OHA website shortly. And we'll send it out to folks who registered for this meeting as well.
Thanks again, Amy.
You're welcome. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everybody. And the recording will be made available on the website. I dropped the link in the chat a couple times, so find that there. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Kathy. Thank you, Lisa.
Thank you. Have a good night.
Yeah, you all have a great day.
Thank y'all.
Bethany, did you set the cloud recording or?
Yes.
Okay, all right. Yeah, so we should get an email when that's ready. All right. I think everything went well. Yeah, we'll have more control over people joining with mics on and things like that when we go to webinar mode, because they'll by default have no authority. So yes. Okay.
All right. I'll go
Great
ahead
job.
and close it out.
All right.
See you later.